Geography is destiny. As countless historians have pointed out, Europe isn't really a separate continent. It's actually a jagged extension of Asia, a series of peninsulas jutting out into the sea. There is no massive impassable wall dividing these two worlds. The vast steppes north of the Black Sea are just a continuation of the steppes of Central Asia. For millennia, this has been a highway for humanity, a corridor through which tribes have swarmed since the dawn of recorded history in the 3rd millennium BC, settling in Europe or southeast of the Caspian Sea. Among the very first Indo-Europeans to reach the Mediterranean coast were the Achaeans, appearing in the Peloponnese around 1600 BC. They built the Mycenaean civilization and launched the legendary destruction of Troy. By 1100 BC, new waves arrived. The Dorians settled in Greece, while the Philistines gave their name to Palestine. But what made the Greeks unique wasn't their migration, but their organization. They built the polis, the city-state. Starting in the 8th century, they began to expand, planting colonies from Sicily to the Black Sea. But this expansion was about to hit a wall, a massive imperial wall rising in the east, the Persian Empire. The trouble started after King Darius's expedition against the Scythians in 514 BC. The Persian footprint expanded into Thrace, and the Greek cities of Asia Minor fell one by one to the great king. Then came the spark, the revolt of Miletus in 498 BC. Athens and Eretria sent 20 ships to support the rebellion, a gesture that would have consequences. For a moment, the Persian yoke was shaken off, but the empire struck back hard. By 494, Miletus was destroyed. By 492, Darius's son-in-law, Mardonius, had reconquered Thrace and Macedonia. Now, Darius demanded submission. He wanted earth and water from the free Greek cities. The power imbalance was so terrifyingly vast that many Greeks felt submission was inevitable. As Herodotus famously wrote, up until the clash of 490, the Greeks feared even the name of the Medes. You have to understand the scale of the enemy. The Medes were tough mountaineers and elite archers who formed the backbone of the Persian forces. Darius had organized this military machine into perhaps the most perfect army the world had seen up to that point. Their units were decimal, 10,000 men divided into battalions and companies. The Royal Guard, the infamous Immortals, and the cavalry were pure Persian power. This organization was the key to the great king's dominance. If he re-established control here, Europe would become nothing more than a dusty, peripheral annex of a vast Asian empire. Enter Hippias, an exiled Athenian traitor. He convinced the king to launch a punitive strike against Athens and Eretria, hoping to rule his old city as a Persian puppet. Guided by Hippias, the Persian commanders Datis and Artaphernes swept across the Aegean, taking Naxos and burning Eretria. This was the dawn of the Median Wars, the first true collision between Europe and Asia recorded by history. For Darius, this expedition of 490 BC was a side quest, a minor police action against some troublesome dots on the map. But for the Greeks, this was the apocalypse, and in hindsight, they were right. If Athens had fallen, the entire trajectory of Western civilization would have shifted. Greek culture would have evolved as a mediocre, provincial flavor of Persian civilization. It is almost impossible to imagine the spiritual and intellectual evolution of Europe without the rational, humanistic explosion of classical Greece. From our perspective, the accident of 490 BC is symbolic. It was the first heavyweight title fight between two worlds. Saving Athens meant saving the possibility of the Europe we know. But let's be honest, the Athenians of 490 weren't thinking about philosophy or the future of Western civilization. They were thinking about survival. They were terrified. The barbarians were landing. The Athenians debated fiercely. Do we fight this juggernaut, or do we submit? Their defense relied on the reforms of Cleisthenes. Each of the 10 tribes provided a regiment of hoplites, heavy infantry, and a squadron of cavalry led by 10 strategoi, generals, and a commander-in-chief, the polemarch. This was a democratic army of free men. Their formation was the phalanx, usually 16 rows deep, though it could vary. Their gear was simple but effective. Helmet, breastplate, round shield, lance, and sword. They didn't bother with complex tactics or strategy. Before 490, Greek warfare was essentially a ritualized shoving match or a series of duels. They loved the spear. They despised the bow, which explains why Homer mocks the archer Paris. And cavalry? It was practically non-existent. It wouldn't play a real role until much later. Athenian manpower alone wasn't enough. They sent their professional runner, Phidippides, sprinting to Sparta for help. Meanwhile, the leadership was paralyzed. 5 generals wanted to fight. 5 wanted to surrender. It came down to Miltiades. He was the one who urged the polemarch Callimachus to cast the tie-breaking vote for war. That single vote decided the fate of Athens. Callimachus marched out with roughly 10,000 men to Marathon, where the Persians had landed. They were joined by just 1,000 loyal Plataeans. And the Spartans? They didn't show. They claimed they couldn't march until the moon was full. A religious observance that left Athens to stand alone. For several tense days, the two armies just stared at each other, with the Athenians blocking the road to their city. Herodotus doesn't give us the exact Persian count. Later writers threw around wild numbers, like 100,000 or even 300,000. Historians have long painted a picture of the Greeks staring down an endless Asian horde. But let's look at the logistics. The plain of Marathon is small. A massive army couldn't even deploy there. Furthermore, where was the terrifying Persian cavalry? It didn't participate in the battle. This leads many military historians today to suspect the Persian force was actually smaller than we think, perhaps equal to, or only slightly larger than, the Greek force. Some even theorize that the Persians were already reloading their ships to leave and attack Athens directly, which is why the cavalry was missing. This might have been the moment the Greeks caught them off guard. The surprise wasn't the Persian invasion. The surprise was the Greek aggression. The Persians never believed these few men would leave their defensive positions. But on roughly September 21st, Miltiades gave the order. As Herodotus recounts, the Athenians threw themselves in a wild rush upon the enemies. The Persians thought they were looking at lunatics. No cavalry, no archers, just a mad sprint. But there was a method to the madness. The Greeks ran to minimize the time they were exposed to Persian arrows. Once they slammed into the Persian lines, the dynamic changed. This was hand-to-hand combat, and here, the Greeks had the advantage. Heavy armor. The Persians had almost none. Discipline won the day. The Greek center, thinned to just 4 rows, actually buckled and was pushed back. But this was a trap, accidental or not. The Greek wings, stacked 8 rows deep, crushed the Persian flanks and then swung inward, enveloping the enemy center. It was a slaughter. Herodotus claims the Persians lost 6,400 men, while the Athenians lost only 192. The fact that the Greeks could win by flanking proves the Persian line wasn't as overwhelmingly long as the legends say. The battle was won, but the war wasn't over. The surviving Persians scrambled onto their ships, picked up their prisoners from Eretria, and sailed for Phaleron, the port of Athens. They hoped to get there before the Greek army could return. This leads to the true marathon. The exhausted Greek troops didn't rest. They realized the stratagem and force-marched in full armor back to the city. They arrived just in time. When Darius and Artaphernes sailed into the harbor, they saw the very same army that had just beaten them at Marathon, waiting on the cliffs. The Persians decided they had had enough. They turned their ships around and sailed back to Asia Minor. The result of Marathon was psychological nuclear fusion. The most important effect wasn't tactical, it was confidence. The question changed from, should we surrender, to how do we win? The Greek cities realized their own strength and the necessity of unity. As one writer put it, Marathon is a brilliant prologue to a great drama. The Persians weren't done. An uprising in Egypt bought the Greeks some time, but in 480 BC, King Xerxes returned with a massive vengeance. We know the beats of that story. The tragic sacrifice of the Spartans at Thermopylae, the brilliant naval victory of Themistocles at Salamis, and the final smashing of the Persian land army at Plataea in 479. The Persians eventually gave up on conquering Europe, but the wheel of history kept turning. A century and a half later, the Greeks would exhaust themselves in civil wars, opening the door for a new power, Macedonia. Philip II and his son, Alexander the Great, would reverse the flow, taking the Greek world on a conquest of Asia. But all of that, the Roman Empire that followed, the history of the West, rests on the foundation of that one day in 490 BC. For millennia, our view of history was locked to the Mediterranean basin, with only legends coming from the outside. But in that restricted arena, the military assertion of Europe began at Marathon.